The dry season had pulled the savanna thin, leaving the earth cracked and the grasses brittle against the wind. Heat shimmered across the horizon, bending the air in a wavering haze. From the stillness of the brush came a movement so subtle it seemed almost accidental. The figure of a lion, pale beneath the sun, emerging one step at a time. His coat carried the dust of many restless nights, his mane dull and thinned. Each rib was visible, pressing sharply against skin drawn tight by hunger. His steps were deliberate but fragile, as if the ground itself were a burden. The rangers inside the parked truck noticed first the way the brush gave way too slowly. The lion's body pushing forward with a quiet persistence that seemed less like strength and more like surrender. Normally, lions kept distance, their presence a warning rather than a plea. Yet this one moved closer, each pace careful, not as a predator stalking prey but as a creature carried by need. His tail dragged low, swaying only when his legs faltered. He did not roar. He did not growl. Instead, silence clung to him, a silence louder than any sound the savanna could make. The wind whispered through thorn trees, but his presence drowned even that. His head hung low, golden eyes clouded and sunken, glancing not with the sharpness of a hunter but with the dim light of exhaustion. Dust rose with each step, gathering around his paws like smoke. Inside the truck, one ranger leaned forward slightly, his voice no louder than a murmur. "Stay calm," he whispered, though the words seemed more for himself than for anyone else. His colleagues did not answer, but their stillness was its own reply. The moment carried a fragile weight, like glass set down on stone. The lion stopped a short distance away, standing in the shadow of the vehicle. His chest rose and fell unevenly, each breath shallow, as though the air itself cost him strength. For a long moment he did nothing but stare at the earth between his paws, as if measuring whether he had the will to take another step. The skin around his shoulders trembled with the effort of standing. Flies circled his face, clinging to the corners of his eyes where tears had dried into a fine crust. The air smelled of dust and dryness, mixed faintly with the musk of an animal long without food. His body swayed once, twice, then steadied, legs stiff against collapse. He looked toward the truck, gaze unfocused yet intent, as though sensing within it a pause in the emptiness around him. Not prey, not threat, simply presence. The rangers exchanged quick glances. It was a scene outside the rhythm of their daily work. A lion, so near, yet without aggression, without the restless fire they knew from others of his kind. They remained still, their bodies speaking what words could not. Patience, respect, quiet waiting. The truck's metal frame ticked softly in the heat, the sound of expanding steel marking time. The lion lowered his head further, licking at his dry muzzle with a tongue that seemed heavy from thirst. His whiskers drooped, twitching only faintly as he shifted his weight. The pads of his paws were cracked, edges darkened from miles walked on unforgiving ground. When he blinked, it was slow, deliberate, as though even that small act required thought. For a moment, it seemed he might collapse where he stood. His hindquarters trembled and his front paws pressed deeper into the dirt. Yet he steadied himself again, shoulders lifting in one last effort of pride, the echo of what he once had been. A lion, full and strong, carrying the authority of his kind. Now only the outline of that strength remained, stretched thin across hunger. The rangers felt the weight of his nearness. One shifted slightly, then stilled again, as though fearing that sound alone might shatter the fragile peace between them. The lion's ears flicked, catching the noise, but he did not retreat. He stood still, breathing shallow, watching the truck as if waiting for something unseen. The sun tilted westward, casting his shadow long across the dust. Around him, the savanna carried on, a pair of hornbills crossing the sky, the distant cry of a jackal, the low hum of insects weaving through grass. Yet in this clearing, time slowed. All sound gathering around the figure of a starving lion and the silent figures who bore witness. The moment held steady, fragile yet enduring, as if nature itself paused to breathe with him. The lion stood only a short distance from the truck, his body motionless except for the slow rise and fall of his chest. Dust clung to his flanks, and the faint tremor of his legs betrayed how little strength remained. The rangers inside the vehicle could see his eyes now, once bright with the sharp confidence of a hunter, now dulled and clouded by days of weakness. There was no fire in them, no challenge, no dominance. Instead, the hollowness of hunger filled their golden depths, an emptiness that spoke louder than any roar. The men remained silent, hands resting quietly, their movements measured and slow. They knew that even in weakness a lion was powerful, unpredictable if startled. Yet what they witnessed was not aggression, but something unfamiliar, a stillness edged with surrender. One ranger leaned slightly forward, speaking in a voice so soft it might have been carried away by the wind. "Easy now," he whispered, his words not command but reassurance, fragile offerings carried into the heavy silence. The lion's ears flicked at the sound, but he did not retreat. His gaze shifted faintly, not fixed on the truck itself but on the space just before it, as though standing between worlds. The wild he belonged to, and the presence of humans he would never normally approach. His jaw parted, a rough breath rattling from his throat, then closed again with effort. A strand of saliva hung briefly at the corner of his mouth before falling to the earth. The rangers could see the tightness of his body, each muscle straining simply to hold him upright. His ribs moved with each shallow inhale, skin stretched so thin it almost seemed to hum against bone. His tail stirred once in the dust, a faint motion that left a curved mark before it stilled again. No sound came from him, no growl to warn, no low rumble to declare presence. Only the quiet weight of survival clung to his form. Around them, the savannah held its breath. The calls of birds seemed distant, and the insects that usually filled the air with constant hum felt muted. Even the wind seemed to slow, brushing gently across the lion's mane, lifting strands that fell back limp against his neck. It was as though the land itself recognized the rarity of this moment, a predator so near, yet stripped of threat, replaced by raw need. The rangers knew well the signs of an animal at the edge. This was no simple hunger that would pass with the kill of a small antelope or the scavenging of a carcass. This was deeper, a body worn by time and loss, a creature caught in the thinning line between life and collapse. His eyes told the story without words, days without food, nights without strength, a life narrowing into stillness. One ranger shifted in his seat, a quiet movement that sent a creak through the frame of the truck. The lion's eyes turned at once, drawn by the sound, but not sharpened by aggression. There was no lunge, no flex of muscle ready to strike, only the tired gaze of an animal too weary to fight, too weak to retreat. The ranger stilled, lowering his head slightly as though offering calm in return. The lion lowered his body fractionally, his front legs bending as if to rest, but he stopped himself, forcing his weight back onto trembling limbs. His gaze remained fixed, unwavering, holding the rangers in a silence that stretched longer with each passing breath. He seemed to be measuring something, not choice, not trust, but simply the presence of life around him, a reminder that he was not yet alone in the emptiness. His breathing grew louder, harsh against the quiet. Each exhale rattled softly, as though carrying dust from deep inside. His eyes flickered once more, hollow yet steady, and in them the rangers saw no malice, no demand, only the plea of a body trying to endure. The moment stretched thin, fragile as glass, as the lion swayed in the heat, and the men waited, hearts steady, voices held back. The eyes of hunger told them everything, and in their stillness they listened. The lion's body gave way slowly, as though the earth itself had reached up and claimed him. His forelegs bent first, stiff and trembling. followed by his haunches that folded beneath the weight of bone and weakness. Dust lifted softly around him, settling across his thin coat as he sank to the ground beside the truck. There was no growl, no defiance, only the heavy silence of an animal too drained to resist. His ribs expanded with shallow breaths, each one a fragile rhythm, as though even air came at a cost. The rangers inside the vehicle did not move at once. They watched as the lion settled into the dirt, his body pressed low, head resting against the dry ground, his mane spread like a faded crown, flattened and tangled, lifting only when the faintest breeze passed over. His tail lay still, curved weakly across his hind leg, and his eyes closed for a moment that seemed longer than comfort allowed. He looked less like the ruler of this land and more like a ghost of it, worn thin by hunger. One ranger shifted at last, his hand resting gently on the door before opening it. The hinges groaned softly, a sound that caused the lion's ears to twitch, though no other motion followed. The ranger paused, waited, then stepped down with slow and measured care. His boots pressed into the dry soil without hurry. Another followed, mirroring his calm, their bodies angled low, hands at their sides, movements unthreatening. They did not approach directly but kept a respectful distance, their presence quiet, almost reverent. The lion's head lifted briefly, eyes half open, glancing toward them without focus. He did not bare his teeth, nor raise his body in defense. Instead, he lay still, his chest shuddering once as a low moan escaped, rough and unsteady, carried more by weakness than by will. It was not a roar. It was not warning. It was the sound of a body admitting the depth of its need, a sound that reached the rangers with the weight of something unspoken. One of the men whispered, voice no louder than the rustle of grass. "Easy, boy," he said, the words shaped not as command but as comfort. The lion blinked once, slowly, before his gaze drifted back toward the dust beneath him. His paw shifted faintly, claws dull and chipped, scraping the earth as though searching for strength that was no longer there. The rangers paused, reading his body for signs of unrest. Yet there was only stillness, broken by tremors that rippled through his muscles. His flanks quivered with the effort of breathing, and his nose twitched at scents carried by the breeze, the faint musk of men, the lingering oil of the truck, the sharper tang of dust and heat. But his body remained pressed low, a gesture of surrender that felt out of place on this vast land where lions usually held dominance. Time stretched in careful silence. The rangers moved no closer, but their presence itself became a quiet answer to the plea laid bare before them. This was no meeting of predator and prey, nor of danger and fear. It was something stripped down, simple and raw, a creature on the edge and the quiet compassion of those who bore witness. The lion's breathing grew uneven, chest rattling as though each inhale might be the last. Yet he did not retreat into shadow, did not vanish back into the brush. He chose to remain, lying beside the truck as though the nearness of another life, even human life, carried a weight of safety. It was the most unlikely of moments, a wild king of the plains lowering himself in vulnerability, offering no challenge, only silent request. The rangers stood in stillness, their eyes meeting briefly. No words passed between them, yet understanding flowed as clear as the savannah's horizon. They could not turn away. The lion remained still in the dust, his breaths shallow and uneven, the weight of hunger pressing down heavier than the heat of the afternoon sun. The rangers, standing at a cautious distance, exchanged quiet looks. They carried in their truck a small reserve of food, scraps kept for emergencies when wild creatures, too injured or too weak, were found on the edge of life. Few had imagined such a moment would arrive with a lion. Yet the sight before them left little room for hesitation. One ranger moved slowly to the rear of the truck, his steps unhurried, each motion deliberate so as not to disturb the fragile calm. The others remained near the lion, their eyes watching for any flicker of unease. The lion's ears turned faintly toward the sound of shifting metal as the box was opened, but he did not rise, nor did he bare his teeth. His body lay heavy against the earth, eyes half-lidded but aware. The ranger lifted a small portion of meat, the scent of it faint but sharp against the dry air. He walked a short distance forward, then knelt to place it down on the ground, far enough that he would not intrude yet close enough that the lion could reach if he chose. When he stepped back, he did so with the patience of someone carrying a fragile vessel, careful not to let the silence break. For a long moment, nothing happened. The lion did not stir. His head rested on the earth, muzzle pressed into the dust. Flies gathered at the corners of his eyes, undisturbed by any attempt to brush them away. But then, slowly, his nostrils twitched, flaring at the scent. His eyes opened wider, and his head lifted by degrees, as though pulled upward by hunger itself. The skin around his shoulders rippled with effort, muscles weak but not yet gone. He looked toward the offering, unblinking, the golden light of his eyes dim but steady. His tongue passed over his dry muzzle, and with a slow shift he stretched his foreleg forward, claws dull against the earth. He dragged his body closer, pausing halfway as though the motion itself drained him. Another breath rattled through his chest. Then, leaning his head low, he reached the scraps and took them gently. No growl, no rush, only the careful bite of one who knew how little strength remained. The rangers watched in stillness. It was rare to see a lion feed without dominance, rarer still to see one eat in silence, each mouthful slow, deliberate, and fragile. The meat disappeared in small portions, swallowed with effort. His jaws worked steadily, though not with the power of a predator at his prime. Instead, every bite carried the weight of survival, as though the act itself was more than nourishment. It was endurance, a tether holding him to life. One ranger whispered, his voice little more than breath. "That's it. Easy now." The words hung between them and the lion received without protest. Answered not in sound but in the steady continuation of eating. The men did not move closer. They did not push. They let the silence carry, broken only by the faint scrape of teeth on bone and the dry rustle of grass shifting in the wind. When the meat was gone, the lion lowered his head again, resting his chin against the dust. But there was a difference now. His sides no longer heaved as violently, and his gaze, though still tired, seemed steadier. His eyes lingered briefly on the rangers, unthreatening, as if acknowledging their presence not as danger but as a quiet fact of this moment. The bond formed there was unspoken, fragile as the air, yet undeniable. Trust had not been forced. It had arrived through necessity, through silence, through the simplest act of giving. And for that moment in the heart of the dry savanna, predator and man stood within the same fragile circle of survival. The lion lay quietly for some time after the last scraps of meat were gone, his body still pressed low against the earth. The faint tremors in his flanks slowly began to ease, each breath settling into a steadier rhythm. The rangers did not move, their silence mirroring his, their patience forming a respectful distance between man and beast. It was a pause suspended in the heat of the afternoon, fragile but profound, as if the savanna itself wished to give him this moment of stillness. Then, with a slow shift, the lion stirred. His head lifted first, mane brushing against the dust, eyes opening with a clarity not seen before. They were still hollow, still tired, but behind them glimmered the faintest return of strength. His forelegs stretched forward, paws wide against the soil, claws catching slightly as he pressed himself upward. The movement was labored but sure, carrying the weight of a body that had chosen not to surrender. His hindquarters followed, rising in a slow arc. For a moment he stood unsteady, his legs trembling beneath him, swaying slightly in the heat. The rangers watched, motionless, ready to accept whatever choice he made. But the lion steadied himself, shaking his mane once, sending a cloud of dust into the air. his shoulders lifted. And with that motion came the quiet return of dignity that hunger had stripped away. He began to walk, not with the heavy stumble of before, but with steps that carried a measured firmness. Each pace pressed into the earth, leaving faint prints in the dust. His ribs still showed, his body still frail, but there was purpose in his stride now, as though the simple act of rising had rekindled something vital. The rangers remained at their places, their faces softened with quiet awe. They knew the moment would not last, that the lion belonged to the wild beyond them. The lion did not look back. His path turned toward the tall grass that swayed at the edge of the clearing, golden blades moving gently in the late light. He slipped into their shadows, his tawny coat blending with the land as though he had never been apart from it. Only the slow movement of stalks marked his passage, rippling in waves until even that faded into stillness. The men stood for a long while, listening to the silence he left behind. It was not emptiness, but a silence heavy with meaning, filled with the knowledge that they had witnessed something rare. A predator, proud and untouchable by nature, had come forward in need, laying himself low not in dominance, but in plea. And in that moment, humanity had answered with gentleness instead of force. One ranger exhaled quietly, the sound carrying like a sigh of release. "He'll make it," he murmured, not as certainty but as hope woven into words. The others did not reply, for nothing more was needed. Their eyes remained on the place where the grass had last shifted, knowing the savanna had reclaimed its sun. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, light stretched long across the plains, painting the earth in copper and gold. The air cooled, carrying with it the faint rustle of leaves and the distant calls of unseen birds. The wind moved softly through the grass, bending it in slow waves that mirrored the lion's departure. The rangers turned back to their truck at last, steps quiet, hearts humbled by what had passed. They left with the knowledge that not all encounters are written in power or fear. Some are shaped in silence, in hunger, and in the fragile space where life and survival touch. The savanna kept the secret, holding it within its endless horizon. But in the hearts of those who had stood there, the memory would remain. The day a starving lion rose again and walked back into wildness. The savanna lay open and vast after the lion's form dissolved into the grasses, the horizon stretching in muted colors beneath the settling light. The rangers stood quietly, listening for any sound that might hint at his passage. A broken stem, the faint push of his body moving deeper into cover, but the land had already swallowed him whole. All that remained were the fading prints he had pressed into the soil, soft indentations soon to be erased by wind and time. One ranger crouched near the ground, running his fingers lightly across the edge of a paw mark. The impression was shallow, almost delicate for an animal known for its weight and power. It spoke not of dominance, but of fragility, a reminder of how close the lion had come to collapse. He did not speak, for words would have broken the quiet truth of what they had seen. The others remained still, their faces turned toward the last place the lion had vanished. It was not triumph they felt, nor sorrow, but a deep humility. They knew the wild carried stories unseen, lives lived and lost without witness. Yet on this day they had been asked to bear witness, to stand at the edge of survival and answer with compassion. The sky shifted above them, the blue of day giving way to the softer tones of evening. Clouds stretched thin across the horizon, tinged with orange and rose. The air cooled, brushing against the ranger's skin, carrying with it the sense of dust, dry grass, and the faint lingering musk of the lion. In the distance, a herd of antelope moved cautiously across a ridge, their silhouettes sharp against the fading light. Life continued, unaware of what had passed in the clearing. The rangers climbed back into their truck, doors closing softly, the engine left silent. They did not yet drive away. Instead, they sat together in the stillness, each man carrying his own thoughts. The lion's image remained vivid, his trembling body, the slow acceptance of food, the unsteady rise to his feet. These moments did not feel like interventions, but like shared breaths in a place where the line between life and death was drawn so fine it could vanish in silence. The youngest of them spoke, his words barely above a murmur. "We gave him a chance," he said. It was not boastful, not even certain, but an observation, gentle and plain. The others nodded faintly, their eyes still fixed on the horizon. They knew that chance might not be enough. The lion could falter again, the wild might not provide soon enough, predators or rivals might take advantage of his weakness. Yet none of that lessened the truth of what had been given. A chance, however small, was still life extended. The grasses swayed in waves as the wind grew stronger with the setting sun. Somewhere far off, the low call of another lion echoed, distant but steady, reminding them that the land still belonged to those who endured it. Perhaps the weakened male would find his way back to such calls, perhaps not. That future lay beyond their reach. What remained in their hands was only the memory of this meeting, fragile and unforgettable. The first stars appeared faintly as the sky deepened into twilight. Darkness gathered at the edges of the plain, and with it came the chorus of nocturnal voices, insects singing, a nightjar's cry, the rustle of unseen movement in the brush. The rangers finally turned the key, the hum of the engine rising softly before the truck rolled forward across the dust. They did not look back, for there was nothing left to see, only to remember. In the wild, survival was rarely gentle. Yet on this day, for a brief stretch of time, it had been softened by compassion, a fragile exchange between man and beast, carried out in silence. And though the lion had disappeared into the grasses, the savanna itself seemed to hold the moment close, as if unwilling to let it go. The truck disappeared into the falling dark, leaving behind the clearing, the fading prints, and the memory of a starving lion who had risen, taken his chance, and walked back into wildness.